Welcome back to the cs161 tutorial. We're going to address our second iteration in this part of the tutorial. Iteration 2 objectives will be the following. First, we're going to add the guests component to the GUI, and in doing so we're going to have to modify the code of the I Do Catering GUI class. You'll see the new version of our GUI has the guest panel, and that guest panel contains a couple of components here. Secondly, we're going to modify our model component reception plan to incorporate data members so that we can record the number of adult guests and the number of child guests when the user enters them in these text fields. Finally, we're going to run the program and verify that the correct GUI is displayed and the appropriate event handling is performed. With respect to the design for iteration 2, again, I shaded in gray the components that we're going to address with our revised code. The reception plan, we're going to add a couple of data members and associated methods. I Do Catering GUI, we're going to add some code that's going to be used to add the guest panel. We're going to completely implement the guest panel and its associated text listener. Again, I've borrowed text from the programming assignment to show exactly what we're going to address with respect to the requirements and the design. The reception plan model class, well, we're going to add some data members for two input fields that are shown in the GUI, the adults and the children, and we're going to have both setters and getters for them. Down here, also in yellow, I've indicated that we're going to define a method to reinitialize data members to their default values. Remember, when the reset button is pressed, both the GUI and the underlying model components have to be reinitialized. We're going to completely address the design of the guest panel and the text listener that's associated with it. Alright, so since the guest panel is a view class, we're going to make sure it's got a data member that holds a reference to its associated model object reception plan. We're also going to, because we have to implement the visual components of the GUI, there are two text fields there and there are a couple of labels. The constructor is going to create and populate the GUI component. So all the real work is going to be done in the constructor. And we're going to create a method to reset the text fields to 0. Right? And we'll name that reset. We're also going to instantiate the text listener, that is the controller component, and assign it as an action listener to each text field. So we're just going to have one action listener, similar to what we did with the actions panel. So each text field will invoke the action perform method on that single instance of the action listener. The controller, which is our text listener, it's got a very important job to do. First of all, when it detects an event, it's going to be an event that's associated with the completion of an entry in one of the text fields. It's got to do two things. The first thing it has to do, it has to extract the values from the text field. So it actually has to query a member of the guest panel class, and then it has to use that value to assign the corresponding member of reception plan, which is the model. So the controller accesses both its associated view and its associated model to get its work done. With respect to the GUI requirements that we're going to address, we're going to address the guest component event handling. So whenever the user enters a value for number of adults and presses enter, the program records its value. It's very important here, and when you're doing your own programming with JText fields, it's important to understand that action performed won't be invoked until the user presses enter. So if you just enter a value in the field and then take the mouse and move it somewhere and click on another thing, that event will never be generated, and so that value will likely never be read. Similarly, whenever a user enters a value in the number of children field and presses enter, program records that value enter. These values, of course, will be recorded in the reception plan instance. When the reset button is clicked on the actions panel, the program has to return the GUI to its initial state. Well, the initial state in this case is those text fields will have zeros in them, and the underlying program object, which is a reception plan, has to also reinitialize the associated data members that are keeping track of the number of adults and number of children to 0. With respect to the technical requirements we're going to address, the guest panel is going to be configured with a flow layout manager. So each of its 4 components, the 2 labels and the 2 text fields, will be laid out one after another in sequence. It's going to instantiate that text listener to handle events generated by its JText field objects, and that text listener is going to be declared as an inner class of the guest panel, and it's going to implement the action listener interface, which will imply it will implement the action perform method. Okay, that's an overview of what we're going to be what we're doing in iteration 2. Now we'll switch over and actually develop the code. The first step in evolving our code here for iteration 2 is to address revisions to reception plan. So I'm going to open that up, and I'm going to add 2 data members. One that's going to hold the number of adult guests, and one that's going to hold the number of child guests. And what we'll do is we will add setters and getters for these. So I'm going to ask Eclipse to generate those. And we'll put them after the last data member. Let's see, after GUI. All right, the next step is I want to add, and we'll make this private, I want to add a helper method that can be used to initialize these fields when the user resets the GUI. So I'm just going to use this to set adults back to 0 and children back to 0. And then once I do that, I'm going to create a constructor now. And all that constructor is going to do is invoke init. Okay. So in reception plan, when I create an instance of it, whatever it needs to do to initialize all the data members, that code will be added to init. Now what we also have to do is we have to go down and we have to modify the code in reset. Remember what this method is supposed to do. It's supposed to do whatever changes are necessary to reception plan when the user clicks the reset button. Okay, so in this instance, when the user clicks the reset button, we're going to have to reinitialize all the data members to their default values. Well, I've just implemented this nice init method to do that. Okay, so reset method's going to be invoked. It's going to invoke the helper method init, and then once the reception plan is all reinitialized, we can go and update the GUI as before. I'm also going to add something else here. I'm going to override the toString method. And the reason I'm doing this is I want to add some additional debug code so we can ensure that we still have all our components connected appropriately. That is, that the controllers are connected to our model and the model's connected to the view. So what I'm going to do now, if I got a couple of data members, I'm going to just display those in a very simple fashion. Nothing fancy here about the labeling or anything. Just want to know what each one is. I'm going to put each value on a separate line. And you'll see in a moment how I'm going to use that. All right, so there are the revisions we need to do to the reception plan. Okay, so the next thing I'll do, and the major code is necessitated here, is I'm going to add the guest panel. So the first thing we know is the guest panel has to be a subclass of JPanel. Now what does it need? Okay, well, it's got four GUI components. A JLabel for the number of adult guests, followed by a text field to hold that, and a JLabel for the number of child guests, and a text field to allow the user to enter a value there. So what I'm going to have here is I'm going to need to create two data members here. One for the adults and one for the children. I need to create these as data members because I'm going to need to reference them later in the associated action listener. I don't need to create data members for the labels, although I could, because once the labels are created, I never need to reference them. Let's have Eclipse import those. And then we'll generate the constructor here. Now it's going to be configured with an instance of the reception plan. So we can communicate between the model and the view. Oh, looks like I need to import JPanel 2 there. Forgot that. There we go. Okay, well, I'm first going to add another data member to hold my reference to the reception plan. Then the next thing I'm going to do, since I've got to configure the components here, the text fields, with the associated listener, I'm going to declare the inner class. And we'll figure out what needs to go in here in a minute. Okay, so let's import the action listener, and then let's go ahead and add action action performed. Okay, now we can go back, and I'm going to create an instance of this text listener so I can wire up my JFields to it. All right, now let's configure the properties of our panel. So what we need to do is set the layout manager, and we said this has to be a new flow layout. We also need to put a title on it, so we got to create a border here, and we'll get that from our border factory. And we're just naming this guests. Okay, let's go ahead and import the flow layout class. Alright, so now we've set those properties. Now let's populate our JPanel. We got number of adults. Oh, look at that. I made a little boo-boo there. I don't need to add the label there. It's just JText field, and I'm going to give it a width of 5. Okay. And I'm going to do the same for children. Alright, so I've created those. Now what I'm going to do is add all my GUI components to the panel. So I'm just going to add a JLabel on the fly here, an anonymous instance of the JLabel. And then I'm going to add the adults text field. Then I'm going to add another JLabel for the children. And then we'll add the children text field. I'll go ahead and take care of those compiler errors by importing the JLabel. Alright, now I got to configure my text field with the appropriate controller. I'll do that for the adults, and I'll do that for the children. Then what I want to make sure of is that after this is all set up, I want to make sure that there are zeros here in the adults and the children. So I'm going to invoke this little method reset. And reset is going to be the method that gets invoked eventually whenever the user clicks that reset button on the actions panel. The actual way this is going to work is that the actions controller, of course, is going to detect the event that's generated by that reset button. It's going to invoke reset on the reception plan. Reception plan is going to set those two data members to 0, and then it's going to ask the GUI to reset. Okay, that GUI, of course, is the I do catering GUI. And then that GUI, as we'll see, is going to delegate to this component the responsibility for doing the actual reset. So what I have to do when I reset here, we'll just take the adults and set its text to 0. And we'll do the same thing for the children text field. Very simple. Okay, so that takes care of the constructor and the reset methods. Now I just have to finish the action listener. Okay, now here we have to be a little careful because an action event, that is the user pressing enter, can happen on either of the text fields. So in the controller logic here, we have to ask, what was the source? All right, was it the adults text field? Okay, if so, and I'm gonna work this from the inside out. If so, what we need to do is we need to extract the contents of that text field. Okay, I'm going to have to convert that to an integer because it's a string. So I'm going to convert it to an integer using parse int. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that integer to modify the adults field of the reception plan. Its name is plan. Okay, so the controller figures out what happened, okay, on the view, where that event come from, and then, as controllers all do, it asks its associated model to make some kind of change. Now I'm just going to make an assumption here. If the source isn't the adults text field, it must be the child text field. And I'm going to do the same thing. Except here, I'm going to change this to children. And also change this to children. And that takes care of my controller. So the last thing I need to do is I need to modify my GUI, the I do catering GUI. Now it has an additional component. Recall that the first iteration we added the actions panel, so this iteration we are going to add the guest panel. And it's kind of nice is I'm just going to follow what I did for the actions panel to add the guests panel. Okay, so we created actions panel there. So I'll just create an instance of the guest panel here. And configure it with our instance of the reception plan. Let's see, I added the action panel to the south. The guest panel, it's going to be added in the border layout. It's in the topmost field, and that is the north field. So we'll add that to the north. All right, so that sets up our GUI. Now down here, I'm going to make a couple of changes. First of all, when reset is requested, I'm going to actually reset the GUI. What needs to be reset? Well, I need to reset the guest panel. So here is the main window delegating a reset task to one of its child panels. But the other thing I'm going to do is I got to make sure that not only the GUI gets reset, I got to make sure that the model's been reset. So I'm going to add some debug code here too. And this is why I added the toString method. Okay, what? Oh, I forgot to added the reception plan here, but I neglected to add it as a data member. I don't strictly have to do this for the purposes of addressing all the requirements of the application, of the assignment, but I got to do it if I want to have this debug code work. Okay, so there we go. So now we're all done. Let's test it. All right, so you'll see, here we go. We got a new panel there. Initialize, number of adults 0, number of children 0. All right, let's put something here. Number of adults, number of children. And I'm going to press enter. I'm going to press reset. All right, you get reset requested, adult 0, children 0. All right, that's great. Let's try something else. Let's do 55 here. Let's do 22 there. What happens when I click apply? It says apply requested, but you know what? I don't know if the reception plan was modified appropriately. I just know when I hit reset, it's been reset back to 0, but this apply is not going to work in calculating the reception charges unless these two values were appropriately recorded from the guest panel. So that tells me if I really want to test this appropriately, I also have to ask, whenever apply is requested, I better see what is inside our reception plan. So let's do that. Let's just add some additional debug code. Now we can more thoroughly test. All right, so let's put 100 here for adults, and let's put maybe 20 for children. Now I'm pressing enter here. You can't see that because nothing happens on the GUI when I press enter. But something should be happening behind the scenes. So when I hit apply, oh, look, adults is 0, children are 20. Well, I just have this terrible feeling that I didn't press enter there. There we go. I went back and I hit enter. I do this all the time. I forget to press enter. Okay, let's press reset again. All right, so now we see adults 0, children 0. Also, zeros appear in those text fields. Let's try once again. Let's set adults to 99. Let's set children to 123. Okay, again, make sure I hit enter in each field. Press apply. There are adults 99, children 1, 2, 3. So I'm fairly confident now that I have correctly implemented our iteration 2 design. I'm going to exit and we'll begin on iteration 3.